In this demonstration, I will be deploying DocumentDB. DocumentDB is a NoSQL type of database offering, a managed database service offering in AWS that's MongoDB compatible. Anybody that's worked a lot with NoSQL databases will be familiar with MongoDB. So to get started with this deployment in the console, I'm just going to search for document up in the search bar at the top, and I'll choose Amazon DocumentDB. So that takes me into the console for that management, where I have to begin by deploying a DocumentDB cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Create button to get that started. The cluster identifier is automatically set. The engine version here is set to version 4.0.0. I don't have a reason to change that. And we can also set the instance class, in other words, the instance type or the sizing for our database deployment. I'm going to reduce it down to 2 vCPUs and only 4 GB of RAM. And because we're defining a cluster, we can define how many instances we want deployed in that cluster. So naturally, this is designed for large-scale uses of data that will be stored in the NoSQL database. For authentication, I'll specify a master username, in this case of mbishop, and I'll specify and confirm the master password. I can also go down and turn on advanced settings so I can see the VPC affiliation for this database deployment, the cluster port number, which is 27017 by default, the fact that encryption at rest is enabled by default, and I can select the key used for that encryption. We have some backup retention details we can specify, but I'm not going to change any of those items. I'm just going to go down to the very bottom, and I'm going to choose Create Cluster. And after a moment, we're placed into the clusters view where our cluster identifier is shown along with the 3 nodes that we specified. So if I click on the cluster identifier itself to go into its properties, the cluster status is currently showing as being available. 1 of 3 instances are available because it's still initializing. Down under connectivity and security, this is important information. The first thing is to download the Amazon DocumentDB certificate authority, which you're going to need if you're going to make an authenticated connection to the cluster. So the URL is shown here, along with using perhaps wget if you're on a Linux host, but you might be on a Windows host. You're going to need that. It then talks about using Mongo shell because DocumentDB is Mongo compatible. So we have the command line or the connection string for Mongo, and this is actually specific to our deployment. So the name is correct. We have to have brought down the DocumentDB CA. The username is correct here, mbishop. We would specify our password, of course. If you want to connect with an app to the cluster, then we have the MongoDB command line shown for that. Now, this is more on the database administrator or developer side, but if you want to get into that type of connectivity where you can actually start to manipulate data stored in DocumentDB and query it, you could download the MongoDB shell. Now, the MongoDB shell is even available for the Windows platform. Or if you're a developer and you're using AWS Cloud 9, you could open your IDE. Within there, you could install the Mongo shell. But back here in the console, if I go back to my cluster details, I can go to instances, and the 3 individual instances are shown here. One being the primary, the others being replicas. So when we make a connection to the cluster, given the connection string that was provided, we're going to be connecting to the primary node in that cluster. We can click on any of these individual cluster nodes to get details about them, such as connection strings for connecting to that specific instance. We can also go to the Configuration tab to see the VPC association for where that instance was deployed. And of course, the username is shown as mbishop as per our configuration, and the port is 27017. And straight from the Amazon documentation for DocumentDB, I'll just zoom in a little bit, we start to get a sense of the syntax that we would use to start inserting documents into the database on the singular or individual document level, or how to insert many all at once using db.profiles.insertMany. And further down, the syntax is shown for how we can start searching for specific data using db.profiles.findandmodify. So at this point, we get to where database admins that are specifically familiar with MongoDB compatible databases and developers would work together to build the logic for getting data into and out of DocumentDB.